Welcome to This is Wealth. On this podcast, we ask, what is wealth? What does wealthy really mean to you? Most of us immediately think of money, but honestly, wealth is so much more than that. If you have health, deep friendships, a supportive family, you have great wealth. My name is Liz Crawford. Get ready to be impacted. Today, I'm joined by Mike Bacon, who's been a leader in our local nonprofit world. He began his career fundraising for academic organizations. In 2000, he founded a firm with a partner that focused on helping nonprofit organizations to grow and level up by training board members, facilitating strategic planning, preparing for capital campaigns, major gifts, and general fundraising. A healthy organization attracts high-quality board members. Don't be surprised on the health of the organization you are considering joining. Join me in learning how to assess an organization in this thoughtful and practical conversation with Mike Bacon. Mike, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited about our conversation.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Before we get started, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, and in particular, tell us why you chose the nonprofit industry to make a career out of.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Although at some level, I think it picked me. I was a history major, French and English minor in college. Did not think I was going to go to law school or teach. But as a student, I had been involved with a phone-a-thon program at Trinity where we call alumni asking them for money. And enjoyed it. I wasn't afraid to do it. So I started applying for jobs in the field of college fundraising. The only job offer I got, and it came the day before I graduated from college, was from a college in Ohio, Kenyon College, to work in their annual fund team.
Nice.
And so I kind of thought it was God telling me, this is your only job. You better take it. That's right. So I was there for a couple years and then came back to San Antonio. I missed the warm weather. And so I came back here and I spent 5 years as the first director of development at a school for boys called San Antonio Academy.
Pre-K
through 8th grade. Yes. It's a great school. Wonderful how it has so many generations of San Antonio families that send their boys there. Was there for 5 years and thought I wanted to go work for a charitable foundation, getting money out to good nonprofit causes. So I thought the right hire there would be somebody with a nonprofit background, but somebody who had a business degree. Mm-hmm. And that is not what I had coming out of my liberal arts college. So I went to UT and got an MBA and really tried to hone in on my accounting and financial skills, just to have different tools in my tool set.
Absolutely.
In my last semester of business school, I got hired at a new foundation that was just forming in San Antonio called the Kronkosky Foundation. And it was named for Albert and Bessie Mae Kronkosky. And Albert was, when he died, the single largest shareholder of Merck Pharmaceutical. So that was really the corpus of this new foundation. I was the first grants manager, which meant that I worked with nonprofits that were going through the grants process seeking funds. And I did that for a couple years, and there were parts of it I loved, parts of it that weren't the right fit for me. It's a lot of paperwork and a big foundation. And so I ended up going to consulting and spent about 15 years with an amazing partner, Marion Lee. Marion and I had a company for 15 years together, doing nonprofit consulting, fundraising, strategic planning. We got into job search work. She still does a lot of that today.
Very good.
And then one of my clients at the time was my alma mater, Trinity. I had stayed really involved there as an alum and the alumni board. But I got approached to throw my hat in the ring for what is called the Vice President for Alumni Relations and Development. And so I got hired in 2015 and stayed there. It's now 10 years I've been there. Loved it. I've had a lot of fun. We're doing some great fundraising, and we are really fortunate to have a very strong board, and that makes a huge difference.
So you had nonprofit, then you went business, then you went entrepreneur.
That's right.
You spanned several industries.
The irony is in business school, there were a lot of opportunities I could have had to take entrepreneurship classes.
Yes, and you did.
I never thought I'd need it. I'm not going to go for work for myself. So, some regrets there, but we muddled through it very well. And so I feel like I've done the gamut of nonprofit work.
Yeah. Well, you see a lot of different things when you're in that consulting role.
What I call the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I think that's really fair. I want to dive into that. Our conversation today is kind of from the perspective of a board member or a potential board member in looking at an organization. But let's back up a little bit and talk about why would you even want to join a board? What's the motivation there?
Friends, when they come talk to me about being involved, I ask them this very question. Because if you think about it, this is something that's going to take you away from your business world, your family life, the things you do on the weekends. Nonprofits are going to ask for some small part of that. And so you have to make sure that you're choosing to be on a nonprofit board for reasons that matter to you.
Yes.
For some people, it's that the mission of the nonprofit is incredibly important. Maybe they've had a family member who's been touched by a disease, or they have a passion for something because someone they know has been affected by it and they want to make a difference. So oftentimes, there are plenty of people that serve on nonprofit boards just to get some experience in that sector. But I think most of us are called to do it because we want to help and make a difference. And maybe we've been a donor over a period of time to a cause, and then we get more engaged.
Right.
That's oftentimes why people end up joining a nonprofit board.
So when you're looking at a nonprofit board, we can think of them having a life cycle as well, kind of how your business career evolved.
Yes.
The nonprofit is going to evolve as well. Can you talk about some of the stages that you see of nonprofits?
Right. Well, so when you think about it, especially in the era where so many new nonprofits are being created, they're at the beginning of their life cycle. And oftentimes there's a founder involved, somebody who's charismatic and passionate and is running the programs and doing the books and trying to put together a board.
The entrepreneur of the organization.
Right, yeah. Really the starter. And so in Texas, it only takes 3 board members to create a nonprofit. And so those founding boards are often the circle of friends of the person who got it started. And so at some point, especially as they grow outward and add more board members, they're just trying to get enough people to help with the cause. So think of those early boards as working boards. Roll up your sleeves, jump in. We need you to put on the gala, you to help us set up before meetings. It's really a hands-on experience. And for many of us, those are the kind of boards that we want to be involved in because we like that kind of impact. We like seeing the effect of the work right away. We like feeling engaged. As nonprofits mature, though, they probably get more focused on things like governance and less about the founder. The founder's probably moved on at some point. The executive director is really somebody who the board has brought in post-founder. Right. And so the board's role then in that level becomes hiring and firing that executive director and trusting that he or she is going to manage the operations and the staff.
Right.
So you can imagine that kind of board looks really different than the working board needed at a founder's kind of a scenario.
Yes.
And so when you think about a nonprofit approaching you to be on their board, it's good for you to try and get a sense of where are they in this? Because you may not have the time to be so deeply involved as a working board member, but you can go to a meeting once a month and help participate at the governance level. Each of these boards probably has different demands on your time and energy.
Right.
And you just need to think about what kind of time and energy you have to give.
Sure. Make sure you're a good match and that what you're signing up for is what you think it is.
Yeah. So no surprises is one of my big philosophies when it comes to nonprofit board. And as you and I talk about this, I'm sure we'll talk about some of the surprises that can happen.
Yeah. I think we're always a little bit surprised when we walk into the first meeting.
Well, that's true. And frankly, I think you'll be able to tell where the nonprofit is in their life cycle just by how they approach you.
Yes.
So if staff is the only one approaching you to join, that should be a red flag.
Yeah.
At some point, you need to meet other board members as part of this conversation. Some boards, especially founding boards, are just looking for somebody to fill a seat, and they think you get along with us, so come join us. It's almost like we're getting people that look and feel like us so we can make good decisions together. But as boards become more sophisticated, a lot of them use what you and I would call a matrix, trying to determine what are the demographics we need on this board to have it be diverse. What are some of the skill sets we need? So a lot of times you'll see a board needs a CPA, they need an attorney, they need somebody who understands finance or understands banking. These are probably all skill sets that help us make really good decisions as a board. And so having those in the room while we're trying to make decisions only enables us to make better decisions.
I agree. When I am involved in an organization that has a matrix, I know there's a plan.
Exactly.
And you know who's rolling off and what skill set you're going to lose. So what skill set do you need to be looking for? I think demographics, ages, where they're from in the community, not having everybody look the same.
Right.
All
Those
of that
social
matters.
networks, I think we underestimate. I always think of it as You've got a bubble around you, Liz, of the people you went to school with, where your kids went to school, those families. And if we just recruit board members from the same bubble, eventually our ability to reach out is really limited.
Yeah.
And so theoretically, every one of your board members around that table has a different social network, which only increases the reach of that nonprofit.
Agreed. Your sphere of influence should not be one circle.
That's right. And we see that, unfortunately, I see it all the time in San Antonio.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the organization. If you're looking to join a board, from an organizational standpoint, what are some things people should be looking for? What's a good thing to ask for?
Okay. Well, so the thing you don't want to do is join a board and say a year later, if only I had known.
Yes.
That whole, God, if only they told me, means that you probably should have asked some questions.
Yes.
One of the first ones has to do with planning, strategic plans. So oftentimes nonprofits will create a strategic plan for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, somewhere in that spectrum. And so for you to ask if you're being actively recruited, so can I get a copy of your strategic plan? Their response to that is really pretty telling.
It is, because I'm thinking, ooh, ours is 5 years old and we haven't done one.
Right. So part of it is, hey, it's 5 years old. We need to talk about that.
Yeah.
Another response could be, strategic plan? We don't even have one. And that can be a red flag, because at this point, you think about strategic planning, these nonprofits have limited resources and they have to make good choices based on what those choices yield. And if they're not doing it strategically and not following a plan, and it's just haphazard, it could create problems for that board in the future.
Absolutely. And I can imagine that there's a lack of clarity. So trying to make decisions with different viewpoints around the table, you don't know what the focal point is.
Right.
So how can you make good streamlined decisions?
The way I always think about it is I think about every nonprofit has a mission statement, and think of it like an archery target. And in the center of the archery target is the mission. But over time, programs and services we offer start being peripheral circles in that archery target. And sometimes they're really far away from what the central core mission is. So it's always good as a board to remind ourselves through the strategic planning process, here's our mission. Is it still valid? Do we need to expand it? Have we drifted? Because organizational drift happens a lot.
Yeah. And I can think about, in my mind, as you're asking these questions, yes, okay, do we need to revisit? Okay, what does that mean? Did we get off scope, or was there a really good reason to do that? And
exactly.
We need to rethink what our mission is.
You and I can come up with any, like I think about, here we are out in Bernie, there's lots of great groups out there that do equine therapy. So they're really helping kids who are sick, or maybe it's veterans, taking care of horses. But eventually they start saying, well, we've got this facility, maybe we should run summer camps.
Right.
And now all of a sudden they're in a whole different business model than the equine therapy, but they're using the assets, and maybe it's helping pay for the mission. So there are trade-offs nonprofits make, but eventually, we got to keep looking at that mission. A good strategic plan is our chance to relook at it.
I would love that. It's a red flag right away based on what that answer is.
Yes.
You'll know where they are at things.
Right.
What about if I'm a board member and I'm worried about, say, the organization doesn't have a strategic plan, but I'm really sold on the mission, so I want to come in. What should I be thinking about in terms of protections for me, in terms of liabilities? What kind of things do you ask about that? That's a great question.
And to me, it's almost a non-starter. If the nonprofit doesn't have what we call directors and officers liability insurance, should worry you. Directors and officers liability insurance covers the board as an incorporated entity for the decisions it makes as a board. Now, those decisions still have to be legal. We still have to follow all the guidelines that the state requires of boards to follow in terms of sound fiscal judgment, prudent decisions. But that insurance policy covers anyone who sues the entity from coming after you personally. So it's just, it's not expensive. It's $1,500 a year, maybe $2,000 a year, but it is money well spent because it gives you peace of mind.
Cost of doing business.
It should be. Yes. It should be a basic expense. Where I sometimes don't see it is in starting or founding groups. They just don't have the money to do it. But eventually it's a priority because people won't serve on that board unless they feel safe.
Yeah, absolutely. So $1,500, is that a big expense for them or not? How are you going to know?
So it totally depends. And so where you're headed, I think, is looking at their financials.
Right.
So their financial statements, they should be able to give you a copy of those. If you're really wanting to do your own due diligence, you can go and look at their tax form. It's called a 990. They file it with the IRS, and those are public records. So there are lots of places you can go look that up. But they should be able to provide you with a more current expenses and revenue statements. And as a board member, potential board member, you want to make sure you understand, is this organization in debt? Does this organization's revenue meet its expenses? All of those are pretty normal things to want to have your eyes on. Sometimes people forget that the big expense for a nonprofit is paying for staff. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have staff, we can't perform the mission. So that's different if this is an all-volunteer organization. I get it. But by the time you're being asked to be on a board, chances are good this is a nonprofit that has staff in place. Mm-hmm. And so 80% of the budget going towards staff is absolutely normal in this field. It's how we get the work done. And so don't be afraid of that. If you see it, to me, it just shows that we're putting money into people, and those people are performing the tasks.
Right. And so some nonprofits may not really have assets or facilities. They may be renting space. Mm-hmm. They may not need a big footprint or whatnot. Lots are offering services. So again, that would go back to the bulk being of expenses being for personnel, and maybe they don't deliver. Maybe they don't have a lot of assets on the balance sheet as well. And debt, I think that's a really important point. Who is banking their debt?
Who holds the debt?
How long?
How much is the payback? Because that'll be an operational expense. Yeah, listen, services being offered probably is direct services to clients. And from a revenue standpoint, most nonprofits aren't set up to actually have enough revenue to cover the expenses. That's the nonprofit side of this equation. So that's where gifts and charitable support comes in and makes up the difference. I think about a great nonprofit, the Children's Bereavement Center. It started out of the trunk of the founder's car. Mm-hmm. She was offering therapy, and it grew to what it is today, which is a tremendous entity in a couple different cities. But even today, they provide those services for free. Mm-hmm. And so the whole focus of the revenue is on the charitable gifts to cover the expenses so families don't have to.
Yeah. And, it's very different from a business person putting forth financials and making sure you understand that and bring some of your business mindset to it, but with the idea that fundraising is a huge component for nonprofits.
It's critical, and I know we'll talk more about it, but it is the lifeblood of how these nonprofits maintain their mission. Because even if they are charging some funds for some charge, mm-hmm. it's not the full cost of what it is to provide that service.
Yep.
And they can't, you think about all of our great arts organizations in town. Yes, they may charge you a ticket price to come hear them perform, but it doesn't cover the full cost, because if they tried to do that, it would be unaffordable to most of us who wanted to go see that performance.
Yeah, we can have a whole segue into the arts.
That's right.
And whether we can support that or not. So if I think about the organization, strategy, financials, all of this kind of falls under leadership.
That's right.
So how do you gauge where leadership is, one, in their life cycle, and two, in the organization's life cycle? Are they sophisticated? Are they not? How do you think about that?
Well, I think one of your first questions should be, how long has the CEO or the executive director been at that nonprofit? Post-COVID, the average tenure for a nonprofit CEO is about 10 years.
Okay.
Unfortunately, because of burnout, it's getting less and less over time. But if a good nonprofit has a strong CEO and they've got a really strong board around them, that enables them to stay longer. This is important because if you've got a CEO that's going to be leaving in the next year or two, mm-hmm. I promise you, as a board, you're going to spend a huge amount of time on recruiting and hiring and orienting the new CEO.
Yes.
That'll be a big portion of the work you do as a board member. And then there are ripple effects.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody internally didn't get the job, and so then they leave. And all of a sudden you start seeing key staff members leaving, and the new CEO brings in his or her people. That's all normal. It happens in the for-profit world too.
Right.
But it has an effect on the nonprofit's ability to offer its services. So from where you sit as a board member, knowing kind of where your nonprofit CEO is in his or her tenure, to the extent that they'll share that, because sometimes they play their cards close to their vest. But I think as a board, if you're being recruited, it's a fair question to ask. How long have they been here? And how long do we think they'll stay with us?
Well, and I think your board chair should have pretty good insight into that as well. I think of them as kind of the volunteer side of the equation that should be a resource to all board members.
I love that. And hopefully your board chair and your CEO have a great relationship. Yes. Probably the number one reason why nonprofit CEOs quit or leave is because they have an antagonistic relationship with someone on the board.
Yeah, that's awful.
So it's really hard, especially if the board has got some individual on it that has a dislike for the CEO. When that person becomes a board member, it's unlikely that relationship isn't going to have friction.
So that's a whole nother question that I hadn't really thought of is what's the culture of the board?
Culture of the board is huge, and you don't get that from talking to staff. Right. You're going to get that from talking to other board members. And so it has to do with engagement. It has to do with people giving each other grace, people feeling like they can be honest about the issues on the table. You don't want to be on a board that doesn't talk about the real issues.
I think we've all served on a board where there's been the bad fit for one reason or another, whether the person is trying to make a mark, trying to prove something, but just doesn't mesh with the rest of the board. And I have seen that most of the time they will kind of self-select out when their term is up. But if they don't, then it's really just a thorn in the side of everyone. And
it makes it to where you as a participating board member don't even want to be there.
Exactly.
Because you know it's going to be a tense board meeting, or this person's trying to take over and has their own agenda.
Right.
That's where you have to rely on the current board leadership. The executive committee or the board chair, they're really the ones that have to hold board members accountable. It's really difficult for a staff member or the executive director to be put in that place where they're supposed to hold the board member accountable.
Yeah, that's not their role.
Exactly.
If you have that person, is it up to you to say something to board leadership?
I think if you're feeling the tension, chances are other people in the room are as well. But if you don't say something, you can't guarantee somebody else will.
Right.
Chances are good if you say something to the board chair, he or she be like, "You're right. I need to do something about it. Thank you for telling me."
Yes. We all kind of wait for that squeaky
wheel
at times.
Sometimes it's got to be you, right?
It's well, particularly if it's something that you're passionate about, that you really are invested in the cause and want to see good from it. You don't want that kind of thing.
You don't want one individual to turn you off.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about governance, and you brought up being sued. What kind of things happen in the nonprofit world? I mean, how, as a board member, should you poke your nose into that area and say, hey?
I think you can actually stay really kind of at a high level and say, before I join, is there any pending legal action being considered? So the executive director is required to tell the board if anybody is threatened or has currently filed a lawsuit. The board needs to know that. And so they may not get into the details with you because you're not on the board, but they can at least give you a yes or no on that.
Perfect.
Clearly, if they say yes, it's a red flag that you'd want to know more about. So sometimes so much of the world is HR. It's an HR issue that's happened where somebody's been let go and didn't feel like they should be. Those are pretty typical in the for-profit world. They should happen in the nonprofit world too. Where it starts getting a red flag is if somebody's been injured or if there's some claim from an event we had or something along those lines. That's where you probably want to see if those things can be worked out before you join the board.
Very good.
Again, not if they've got insurance, liability insurance, that board is covered, but you also don't necessarily want to be mired in something that goes public in terms of lawsuits.
Yes. So any headlines to be aware of.
That's right. Legal action could even be, and we've seen it happen in this community, an employee embezzled funds from a nonprofit. And so everybody who's on that board then is frustrated because they're the fiduciary agents and it happened on their watch. And so they feel a little bit tainted by it, even if it had been hidden.
Right.
So that's where you need to ask these questions.
Yeah. But that's a whole nother conversation, I think.
Yes.
Back to controls and what's going on in the organization.
Checks and balances.
It goes back to your leadership.
Why you don't want your executive director also handling the books.
Yes.
Yes, it may be critical of the early stages of a nonprofit development. They're doing every role. But as a nonprofit matures, you need those checks and balances built in. I'm even a believer that the office that receives a charitable gift should not be the office that enters it in and deposits it. So those are the checks and balances we create, even in small teams, to make sure that we have a separate accounting.
Yeah, that makes great sense. There's a lot that can go wrong in any business. And when you have a great mission behind it, you want to see them succeed. And so good controls, good governance, those are very important things. What about fundraising? I think most people, when they think about joining a board, there's this fear of, oh my gosh, are they going to ask me for money? Am I going to have to ask for money? How do you navigate understanding that?
Well, so at some level, our responsibility for board members is to ensure the fiscal health of this nonprofit. We've already established that we can't charge what it fully costs to do whatever it is we do, so we've got to raise money. That said, I have learned in my experience with nonprofit boards that not everybody has the same comfort level with fundraising. Just because I, as a college student, wasn't afraid to call an alum and ask him for money, my roommate would have freaked out at the very thought of doing that. So the way I've always said to it, when I do board training, I used to say to folks, think of it like a continuum. First step is you trust us enough that you will share some names of people we should be in touch with. We're not going to go tell them that Liz said I should call you, but we're going to try and engage with them somehow. The second step is that you trust us enough that you'll actually open the door.
Right.
Liz, I want to tell you about a cause I'm involved with because I think you'd like it too. So opening a door through a call or an email helps the nonprofit move closer to that person. Step 3 is that you'll actually be in the room when we go visit with that person. You don't have to be the one asking for money. Maybe it's the executive director who makes the ask, but having you in the room makes a difference.
Right.
You're their peer. Peer-to-peer giving is the strongest way, and peer-to-peer asking is how it happens. So, and then step 4 is that you feel comfortable enough that you'll actually make the ask. The executive director will be right there with you, but you feel like you can make that ask. What I've learned is that if you're just someplace in those steps, you're helping us raise money. Not everybody is at step 4. And I've also seen people evolve over time as they get more comfortable, as they see the executive director do his or her thing. They start saying, well, I could chime in here. I could make that ask. I'm close enough. But where people get a little worried is if they all think they've got to be in that final stage of being able to ask.
Right.
It takes time to get your comfort level there. And as long as you can help us with any of that, you're helping fundraise.
And how should you think about how much needs to be fundraised and how you go about that?
That's a great question. So when you think about operationally, the annual money we raise helps keep us in the black year to year. But then if we want to do something special, let's say we want to build a new building, buy more land, increase programs, we have to do special drives. And most of the time we call those campaigns, capital campaigns usually, because they oftentimes involve a building or a facility. So in a capital campaign, that's more like a 3 to 5 year effort. And it depends upon what the organization is trying to accomplish. You'll see capital campaigns being in the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. And so you're asking somebody to give a gift probably over 3 to 5 years. We call it a stretch gift. It's more than you would give us in one setting. You stretch it out over a couple years. Whereas if I call you saying, hey, will you help support us this year for the annual fund? It's just a check. It's the check you give to your college every year, or that you help with a particular social service nonprofit. It's the same thing you do every year. Capital campaign is you're doing something bigger, and chances are good you're doing it in a nonprofit where you've already been an investor.
Right.
So I always think of it as sort of steps of engagement. First, you may come to an event and you buy a table or a ticket. You may go to one of our golf tournaments and you participate. And then you start giving us, regardless of whether or not you come to an event, you start supporting us. And then maybe because we've gotten you involved in some way, you get involved in our campaign.
A little donor stewardship there.
Yeah, because we've taken care of you. Yes. But probably more importantly, because you've seen the impact of how your gifts are making a difference.
You mentioned galas. I want to touch on galas. Is a gala necessary?
So funny. Galas and special event fundraising are the least effective way to raise money.
But everybody does one.
Everybody does them, and there are great reasons to do them. You do them to raise awareness. You do them to engage a core group of volunteers in helping plan something on your benefit. You do them to reach out to a bunch of people that have never heard of you, but they'll come sit at their friend's table and learn about you. So those are great reasons to do an event. Fundraising is not why we do events. I like to joke that you can take a group of 10 people and work for 10 months and plan an event that raises whatever, $50,000 before expenses. And by the time you take out the expenses, you've made $30,000.
Right.
Or you can take 2 people out to lunch and raise $30,000.
Right.
And so if you ask me where we need to put time and energy, it's around major gifts fundraising. Gifts over time for specific purposes. We can do the events, but they're always better if it's not because the overriding reason and the urgency is just about raising money.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about donor stewardship. I can't tell you how many organizations I have given money to for a couple years, then stop for one reason or another. I never hear from anybody.
So, and I'm embarrassed by that, and I'm sorry for that.
It's just like a business.
It happens. And so you and I talked about the number one reason why executive directors leave is tension with their board. The number one reason why donors stop giving to a nonprofit is because they don't understand how their gift was used. And you say, well, that's crazy. Of course, they must be using it the right way. But a nonprofit needs to let you know, how do we use your gift? And I'm not talking about the general platitudes that, your gift supported services for children. I get that. But tell me a story. Give me some data. How many kids were helped? Tell me a story. You can change the names to protect them, but tell me stories about how they were helped and what's different in their life. Donors want to understand the impact, and nonprofits sometimes struggle with conveying that because they're focused on the next ask instead of stewarding the one you just made.
Oh, it's so much easier to keep the ones you have and add to them, but you have to take care of the ones you have, and it's hard. It takes a lot of planning, and
I would even say the best ask is how we take care of you on this gift. So your next ask will happen, or your next gift will happen because we've taken care of you for the gift you just made. You'll have that memory in your head about, wow, they quickly got me a receipt. I didn't have to go hunting for it. They told me how my gift was used, and they stayed in touch with me. Good fundraising is relational. It's about being in connection with people. It's not a transaction. It's a relationship. And too often nonprofits, you don't hear from me again until I ask you for the next gift. And you've missed all this time in between to build a relationship. So at our firm, we had a gentleman who was a gamer and really enjoyed that aspect. And he found an organization that creates gaming carts for kids in hospitals. Oh, wow.
And so we give every employee a certain amount of money that they can put towards a nonprofit each year. And so he got a group of employees together and banded them together and said, hey, this is what I want to do. Will you contribute your amount towards this? I love that. And then he came to us and he said, hey, if I get enough money to raise enough money for one cart, would you, as the firm, support a second cart? And we said, absolutely. So we raised 2 gaming carts for a hospital. And I was blown away. I think I had 2 different friends send me pictures of the gaming carts because it has a plaque, donated by Sendero Wealth Management.
Oh, that's so great.
And they were like, thank you guys so much for doing this. And out of the blue, wouldn't have even known these people were there. You're hearing from people
who are actually benefiting in the field. That's so great.
So I think he did it another year for another hospital. And it was just fun to see that your contribution, you heard directly how meaningful it was to the kids there. And you think gaming, that's not that big of a deal. But when you're in the hospital for an extended stay, you lose contact with your friends. And as a child or an adolescent, that can be really depressing and detrimental to your recovery because you start to close down when we need you to be really blossoming.
And as the father of 2 teenagers, this is how they stay in touch with one another.
Yes, it is.
Your example was of somebody just randomly sending you a fun picture of it being in use, but good nonprofits will actually seek out these stories. And then they'll use them at a board meeting to help the board members feel like, hey, let me share with you how our mission is making a difference.
Yes. So I was on the board of Child Safe years ago, and talk about a hard mission. It's about sexual abuse and kids. And, you had me at the get-go of the mission, and I spent several years there, but we all as board members wondered, how do these kids get past this incident that occurred? And it may not be a one-time incident. It may have been going on for years. And it just really almost shuts you down as a parent thinking about how this can happen. They would have these girls come in and tell their story, and they would be vibrant and bubbly and happy and so strong and empowered that you thought, great. Oh my gosh.
This is why we're here.
Yes, and they do get beyond it, and it doesn't define them, and life is beautiful again, and they can go conquer the world. And wow,
yeah, those stories help all of us feel empowered. When I think about the work I do at a college, we oftentimes ask the students who get scholarships to write letters about how, their ability to be at college wouldn't happen if it weren't for that donor's generosity. And that's the kind of thing that makes somebody not only want to pay it forward, but they see the impact education can have on a student's life.
Yes. I think the impact is why we all do it, but we forget, to your point, to share the impact.
Because we're so donors. Focused on either delivering a service or trying to raise the next gift.
Yeah. There's a great lesson in there. Okay, so what if we shift gears and let's talk about the board instead of the organization? I think you had a great question on why me? Why do you want me involved?
And if you're being recruited for a board, it's really, I think it's empowering to you to feel like, all right, they need me for a reason. Liz, we really want somebody who understands the financial markets because we've got to make some big plans. We have an endowment. We're trying to figure out how to manage it properly. And we love your expertise on our finance committee. All of a sudden, you see a purpose and a reason. You see people who've recognized you for something you're good at, and you think, well, that's an immediate way I can help.
You can make a contribution that's meaningful.
That's right. And when I always think about any kind of thing, whether it be asking for money or asking for your time, if I give you reasons why it makes sense, I'm moving you one step closer to saying yes. So by being specific, helping you understand why we need you, you're like, I can see this. Another thing that you'll be able to tell is if it fits in with their bigger matrix. Listen, we've got 14 men and 5 women on the board. We need more diversity on our board. We've got people who live in this part of town. We need people who live in other parts of town, people who attend different faith organizations. All those things help you understand, all right, I see why I can be helpful. Too often boards will just recruit people who are just like them and not give you a reason. So I think it's always good to ask, why me?
So if they can't give you a reason.
Well, if they can't give you a reason, you should at least slow your roll a little bit and maybe ramp up your questions.
Yes. We touched a little bit. Talk more about the matrix and why that's important and how it plays a role for the organization.
So think about kind of the demographics of a board. If everybody looks the same and went to the same 4 schools, chances are good the decisions that you make as a board are going to be relatively similar based on what everyone else in that board would make.
A little bit of an echo chamber.
It can definitely be that. And so it's valuable. I'm not suggesting that you always have to have people playing the devil's advocate.
Right.
But when you've got different viewpoints in the room, you're going to make stronger decisions based upon all of that feedback. You're going to answer the tough questions because they've been asked in the boardroom before the decision gets rolled out to the staff or to the public. So having a board of different age groups, different generations, different ethnicities, different parts of the community, different faith backgrounds, all of those things help a board be stronger in decision making. And we talked about it earlier, it increases the networks they have access to in the bigger community.
What if an organization maybe doesn't have exposure to some areas? How can they go about finding people?
So part of it is you don't have to. Some people think the only way to be involved with a nonprofit is on the board. A good nonprofit is going to come up with lots of ways for people to volunteer that have nothing to do with board service. And then those people that really get excited and enthused about volunteering, maybe they become board members. It's a good way to test people out. And so if you can think about maybe offering programs in a part of the community that you haven't been in, that may draw people to the programs and you can start identifying people who have an interest in it. Back in the day when we had a symphony here in San Antonio, you would see them going outside 1604 to do concerts in an attempt to try and broaden the audience.
Right.
That idea of patron and, frankly, audience development has to be intentional. And so when you think about the audiences or the constituents that use our nonprofit services, by trying to get into parts of town where we don't have a presence, we may be able to find people who can help us from those areas.
Perfect. What about board terms?
So,
unlike politics, where
forever. So most nonprofit boards have a set of bylaws, and in those bylaws, they'll stipulate the terms, and you tend to see 2-year terms renewable 3 times. Sometimes it'll be 3-year terms renewable twice. It's some variation on that. The idea is that most boards need and should have fresh blood coming in on a regular cycle. And so if you've got board members that have been there forever, chances are good they can become fairly entrenched. And how did we do this 3 years ago? Well, It didn't work then, so it won't work now kind of mentality. So those term limits help us determine how long and the beauty of it is that, yes, I can serve up to 6 years, but at my 2-year term limit, if I'm not a fit or you don't think I'm a fit, there's a chance for us to split up. No harm, no foul.
Right.
So the easiest way to learn this is just asking for a copy of the bylaws. Those are public documents. They'll be happy to send them to you. Not only will they tell you term limits, they'll explain how the officers work. They'll explain how the board business works. What are the standing committees that are built into the bylaws? Those are just good for you to know.
Right.
You don't have to memorize them, but ideally the board should look at their bylaws at least once a year just to remind themselves what constitutes a quorum, what are our terms, who are our officers, and how long do they serve. Those are good things to just know as you're serving.
What are the standing committees? How often are they meeting?
That's
are
right.
they getting the work done? Did that committee disband and not come back together?
Well, and frankly, it's a big red flag if the committees aren't meeting.
Right.
Those standing committees, if you've ever been to a board meeting that lasts more than 2 to 3 hours, chances are good you're doing committee work in the board meeting. Yeah. If you've ever planned a menu in a board meeting, you're doing committee work in the board meeting. And so the best boards have committees that meet in between the board meetings, and then they come back and report in. That lets you put the experts in the room, the people that are good at finance, the people that understand audit, the people that understand events, on their separate committees doing that in-depth work, and then they bring back the big picture decisions to the board for approval. That's the way a board should work.
Yeah. It functions really nicely when it does that. Then you don't mind going to a board meeting. So how do you find out if that's happening? You can ask about committees, but what about...
You can ask about, first of all, I would start big picture. What's attendance like? Are the board members coming to meetings themselves? It's always scary to me when you think about the kind of fiduciary responsibility a board member has and they miss a lot of meetings.
Yep.
What if a decision is made and they're not in the room? They're still accountable for that decision that was made without their participation. So that's why you want to go to meetings. And if people, if it's 50% of the board shows up, you know right away there's a challenge around engaged board members. Same with committees. Ideally, the nonprofit has got some standard like you have to come to at least 60 to 7% of the board meetings. And at some level, they should be in person. Maybe 1 or 2 a year can be virtual.
Right.
But you're trying to get people in the room, creating a culture together as they make decisions.
So let's also talk about how the board is made up. You can have small boards of, a half dozen people, but you can also have boards that may have upwards of 50 to 80 people.
I've seen those. And so when you think about those bigger boards, they tend to be more what I would call representational. I think about a great board like the San Antonio Public Library Foundation. 100 members on that board, each give at least $1,000. So part of the reason they have such a big board is they start the year off every fiscal year with $100,000 in the bank. But then there's an executive committee of 15 to 16 people that really make the big decisions, and a couple times a year report back to the rest of the board. So that's definitely one model. Another model, I'm on a board that meets 10 times a year. It's about 30 people, which is still a good sized board, but we have really active committees and each of us serve on 2 to 3 committees. So you kind of have to pick and choose what works best. The standard is not those big boards. It tends to be 6 to 15 people that meet, if not monthly, every other month, sometimes quarterly. And really the reports that you get in between meetings that help you prepare for those meetings are critical, because if you're not meeting on a monthly basis, you need to understand how the finances are flowing even when you're not reviewing them monthly.
So you may not have a board meeting monthly, but you want to make sure committees are meeting
in between
regularly.
That's right.
And making sure the business is happening.
Because if you think about it, if you had a monthly meeting and you're on 2 committees and they meet monthly,
Yep.
all of a sudden you're committing to 3 different meetings every month,
Right.
which is probably more than most people want to sign on for.
Yes.
So if you rotate months for your board meetings and have committees meet in between, it creates a balance where okay, 3 to 5 hours a month I've got, but it's probably not, it's going to stay within that range.
So you mentioned the library has $1,000 minimum for their board members. If I'm looking at joining a board, how should I think about my giving?
It's a great question. And it's really one that you need to have clear expectations on before you say yes. Sometimes they'll say, we'd like you to make an annual gift. And you say, great. And then you're in, and 3 months later, we've got a gala and we need you to buy a table. And then 2 months later, oh, we're doing a golf tournament. Would you sponsor a hole? And all of a sudden you figured out that I'm in for 3 gifts now, not just the one. And so asking that up front gives you a better sense of kind of what the full expectation is in a way that can help you decide, is this the right fit for me? Mm-hmm. Some boards have a give or get policy. You give $5,000 or you help raise $5,000. At some level, you're still going to have to make a financial commitment to that nonprofit. And sometimes I'll get the question, well, I'm giving my time. Isn't that enough?
Right.
The challenge is a lot of these nonprofits are applying to charitable foundations for a gift. And one of the questions that's really standard in those grant proposals is, what percentage of your board financially participates in supporting the organization? And if they can't say 100%, it'll beg the question, why?
Right.
And so
if your board doesn't believe in you,
why would people who are not involved believe in us? The other thing sometimes board members will say to me is like, how much should I give?
Right.
And I always think that you should probably make your biggest gifts where you're a leader. So if you're on, if you support 10 nonprofits, that's great. But if you're on 2 boards out of those 10, those should probably be your biggest gifts, because that's where you're already giving your time and you know exactly how that money is being used.
Right.
So it's up to you as to what level it is. Every now and then, probably the more sophisticated the board, the more likely they are to have an amount that they want to talk to you about. Most nonprofits will say, hey, just give what you can and participate every year. And that covers all our bases.
I've seen where the nonprofit, when they're coming to, ask you to join the board or consider it, they have kind of a term sheet in there. This is what your terms look like as a board member. This is how much the financial donation is expected from board members. This is the number of meetings. We'd like you to serve on a committee. This is the committee, that kind of thing. And
that is so helpful.
It's very helpful.
Because it answers 5 of the questions that you would have needed to ask.
Right.
All on one piece of paper.
Right.
So I highly recommend that practice to nonprofits, because it enables them to pretty quickly assess whether this is the right fit.
Right. We talked a little bit about boards and then the committees. What would be some functioning committees that might be standing in several organizations?
All right.
And what if I'm looking at maybe trying to get involved, is that a good way for me to test the waters before I make the commitment to be a board member?
That's a great question. I'll start with the second half first. Some boards will only let sitting board members stand on committees. Mm-hmm. Some boards are okay with using those standing committees as a way to test new board members. Mm-hmm. And frankly, sometimes the area is so in depth that maybe it's audit, maybe it's investments, where they might need somebody with specialized skill sets who don't have the time to be on the board. So they can put non-board members on those committees. So that just depends upon how they've got it set up. But the typical committees you'll see are operations. So that has to do with the revenues and expenses, usually the running of the nonprofit. Sometimes you'll see governance, recruiting new members, taking a look at our terms, holding people accountable to what they signed on as in their agreement to be a board member. Audit. Every year we'll do an audit. That committee is responsible for hiring the audit firm. Some nonprofits, it costs a lot of money to do an audit, so they may be on an every other year kind of cycle. Mm-hmm. but usually there's a committee that makes that decision. Sometimes there's services. That could be whatever the mission of the nonprofit is. Chances are good you'll find a committee on the board that focuses on that. The mission delivery committee. It'll have a ton of different names,
right,
but it focuses on what we're doing, how do we measure it, what are the metrics. In any of these committees, that's what you're looking for as a board member, is saying to the staff, how do you measure success? How do we set goals based on that, and show me your metrics? And then as a board member, the reports I get are tracking those metrics over the year. So I can look at it. And I'm the kind of board member that I like a little context. Mm-hmm. So show me what these same metrics were year to date for the last 3 years. And then I can judge whether or not we're having a good year. But when I see just a number by itself and I'm not familiar, right, it's harder to guess whether we're on track or off.
Is that a good number or a bad number?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And if you've got context, a 2 to 5 year report that accompanies the metric, then you understand where it tracks.
And a good, whether you're meeting with the development person or the executive director, they ought to be able to tell you that story in the conversation. They should know their metrics really well.
And hopefully the board and the executive director have agreed upon key performance indicators.
Right.
And that's part of their evaluation on an annual basis. We haven't talked about this, but a good board should have a regular cycle of self-evaluation and evaluation of the executive director.
So tell me about the self-evaluation, because I know lots of them that do the executive director.
Right. And that one's almost more standard because we're hiring and firing that person. But from a board standpoint, I think about a self-evaluation in 2 ways. One, first, how are we performing as a board? Are we moving towards the goals in our strategic plan? Do we have good type meetings? Are our committees functioning? You can ask people for anonymous feedback, mm-hmm, and look at the consensus of answers and kind of see how you're faring on those. But then the second way a self-evaluation happens is you as an individual, are my skills and talents being used? Do I feel like this is a valuable use of my time? What recommendations do I have for things we could be doing that we're not? Mm-hmm. How are we tracking? Do I feel like I'm making progress in the reasons I'm here? So self-evaluation and board as a group is definitely, and there are great tools out there. Nobody needs to invent any of that from scratch. You Google board self-evaluation, you'll come up with 30 different ways to do it.
That's a great tip. Back to donor stewardship for a minute. If you're giving a large gift, I know some people who have said, well, I'd like to give that money, and my first response to them is, let's make sure that you have a grant agreement in place.
Yeah.
Talk about a little bit just about some governance around practices that you should have with donors.
Well, so I always think about these bigger gifts. They're probably happening because I have been a donor for the last however long, 3 to 5 years. A friend of mine who worked at a big college in Houston years ago told a story that they had just done $1 billion campaign. Massive amount, the biggest they'd ever raised money. And this was 20 years ago. And they were trying to figure out what were the common characteristics of their $1 million donors. And they searched through all the data, and the main thing they could figure out is the $1 million donors had each given a gift 7 years in a row. Didn't matter how much. It's just they were consistently giving every single year for at least 7 years. And so I tell that story to remind people that big gifts aren't usually pulling rabbits out of hats.
Right.
They're based on being in a relationship for a long period of time with somebody who understands us, sees our impact, and feels like we share their values.
And is committed to it, obviously.
Right.
They've given for that many years.
Consistently, and they're ready to further invest. So you're at that point. They're already a longtime donor. They're considering a big gift. You probably want to put in writing things to make sure that you honor their intent. So we see it a lot with scholarship gifts. Somebody says, I really want to make a scholarship gift to help kids that can't afford Trinity. Mm-hmm. Great. That is an easy thing to put together. The challenge is when they start adding additional filters. And I want them to be from my high school in West Texas. Right. And I want them to have played football there. And now all of a sudden, we've got so many filters on a scholarship, it's really hard for a college to give out that scholarship. Right. So we always try to get people to think broadly about what they're trying to do and to keep the donor pledge agreement at the broadest level. From there, you want to state the terms. This is a gift I'm going to make over the next 3 years. I'm going to pay this much a year. Please remind me each year. This is a gift I'm going to make over 5 years, probably in February of every year, and this is how much. And most people will just divide out the gift evenly into those pledge payments. So you're stipulating how much, the time frame, what name they want to use. Sometimes I don't want the gift to be in my name, but I want to honor my parents with this scholarship. So their name's on the scholarship. So you're really trying to lay it out there for them. Increasingly, you see, and maybe it's because of sports arenas and sort of the big corporate gifts, but even some namings of buildings are for a period of time.
Yes, 10 years.
10 years, 20 years, the lifetime of the building, because they know 30 years from now when they have to redo that building, they're going to have to raise money again.
Right.
And the lobby you gave to is going to look completely different.
Right.
So nonprofits have to figure out how they have that conversation with the donor, because some people are thinking about in perpetuity.
Yes.
And you can't always honor that.
Yes, I think, that's where I've seen some of these conversations come up is, like you said, the building no longer serves its purpose.
That's right.
We have to knock it down, but we want to go back to that family. How do we do this?
Exactly. And so you have to think consciously about, have we stewarded them over the last 30 years? Are they still in touch with us? Can we give them another naming recognition in the same space, but it's just not the name of the space anymore? You can try and come up with some alternatives that can help the family still feel they're engaged, even if they're not ready to make a big gift to name the new space.
I always tell the people that I'm working with, the grant agreement is to hopefully avoid confusion. It's to lay out what your expectations are, how they're hearing your expectations, so that there are no surprises or unhappiness later.
And all of us in this nonprofit sector read horror stories in the newspapers every now and then about a donor suing a nonprofit because their gift wasn't used in the way they intended. And chances are good these agreements weren't in place,
right?
Or there was mission drift,
right?
Or it was outright somebody didn't use it and they used it for something else and hoped nobody would notice. And so that whole idea of having to sue a nonprofit is just bad for everybody involved.
Agreed.
But the point is, our integrity as a nonprofit means that we have to honor your donor commitment, your intention.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this has been a great conversation. And for people who are considering joining a board or, stepping out into the volunteer space, this is a great little checklist to think through. And what's the organization? What's the status? What's their state? How are they in their life cycle? Where are they in their life cycle? How does this work for you? I think it'll be great for them to think about and to listen to.
Well, it was fun having this conversation with you. I think they can get the full list from your website of the questions, but mainly just do what you love and find joy in it.
So I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
So what does wealth mean to you? Here we've been talking about raising money and giving time and treasure, but if we think about the podcast, This is Wealth, what does wealth mean to you?
I think wealth is not time or treasure, it's fulfillment.
Yeah.
And it is, I started to say it earlier, but finding the thing you love and feeling like there's value in your life because you've been a part of that. I think we all know people who have been born with incredible advantages and yet feel unfulfilled, even for all of that. And then we know people who have been born with nothing and feel great fulfillment because they've been focused and driven. So I think wealth surely means to me, like, God's given me so many things, and how do I use them to help others? That to me is true wealth.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Liz.
No, it's been great fun. Thank you. Well, there are so many great conversations that come from discovering the true wealth in your life. And I feel that when you see wealth for more than money, you will have true clarity in what matters to you. And that clarity will help you in every decision you make. Thank you for spending time with us. I look forward to the next time you'll join us. And remember, wealth is a lot more than money.